On the morning of April 16, 2018, a housekeeper in a hotel in Cancun knocked twice, waited, and let herself into a room where a man worth $500 million lay dead on the bed. On the nightstand was an intake form for a rehabilitation clinic he never checked into. It had not been signed. He was the great-grandson of one of the richest men who ever lived. He carried a name that helped build American banking, American aluminium, and American oil. And he died in a foreign hotel with painkillers in his blood and a fortune in a currency most of his own family did not understand. How does one family gather enough money to bend 3 American presidents to its will, and still bury its heirs alone, in rented rooms again and again, for 100 years? This is the story of the Mellons. At their height they controlled Gulf Oil, Alcoa, and the largest bank in Pittsburgh. One of them ran the United States Treasury for 11 years and was said to govern the White House itself. Adjusted for today's money, their fortune ran into the tens of billions. And yet, a founder who ordered his own son to abandon the woman he loved, a divorce so vicious it rewrote the law of an entire state, and a single principle, written down and locked inside a book, that explains every grave that came after. Watch this not as gossip about the rich. Watch it as a warning about what we hand our children when we give them everything except ourselves. Remember the unsigned form on the nightstand. We will come back to it. Begin not with money, but with a boy on a dirt road in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, in the early 1820s. He is the son of Scotch-Irish farmers, one generation off the boat from County Tyrone, and one afternoon he passes a great brick house standing in order above the mud, and he stops, and he stares. Years later he would write that the sight of that prosperous estate lit something in him that never went out. Not envy, exactly, but a cold and permanent resolve never to be poor, never to be small, never to be at the mercy of the weather or another man's whim. His name was Thomas Mellon. The wanting defined him. As a boy he read one book that rearranged his life, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and decided the farm was a trap and the city was the exit. He studied law. He took the bench as a judge of the Court of Common Pleas in 1859. But the courtroom was never the point. Thomas Mellon made his real money in the unsentimental trades. Foreclosures, mortgages, the misfortunes of weaker men converted patiently into property. Andrew Carnegie, who knew the family, once warned that to leave a son a great fortune was as soon to leave him a curse as the almighty dollar. He may have been thinking of his neighbor. Here is what you must understand about Thomas Mellon, because everything that follows grows from it. He did not believe in sentiment. He distrusted it the way other men distrust debt. He even courted his wife, Sarah Jane Negley, a Pittsburgh heiress, with the careful arithmetic of a man appraising land. In his own memoir, he set down his philosophy of marriage and feeling with a frankness that still chills. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was expensive, and he wrote it all down. In 1885, in a book composed for his descendants, Thomas Mellon and His Times, the founder recorded a single governing principle about the human heart. He meant it as wisdom. It would function, across 3 generations, as a loaded gun left on a table. We will return to exactly what he wrote. In 1869, Thomas Mellon left the bench and opened a private bank in Pittsburgh, T. Mellon and Sons. The Sons mattered more than the Mellon. He regarded his boys, his biographer David Carradine writes, as essentially extensions of himself, and he raised them not in public schools, which he despised, but in a private schoolhouse he built so that no outside idea could soften them. By the time his 4th son, Andrew, was given power of attorney over the bank in 1876, the boy was barely 20. By 1882, at 27, Andrew owned it outright. His father simply handed him the machine. Then came the proving ground. The panic of 1873 tore through the American economy and clawed at the Mellon fortune. And it was Andrew, not Thomas, who steadied the bank. Within a year, deposits had climbed back to where they stood before the crash. The son had passed the only test his father respected. What followed was one of the great accumulations in American history, built in the quiet, methodical Mellon way. Never the loudest man in the room, always the man who owned the room. In the 1870s, Andrew and his brother Richard partnered with a fierce young coke magnate named Henry Clay Frick, financing the carbon that fed Pittsburgh's steel. In 1889, he founded the Union Trust Company. That same decade, he bankrolled a struggling experiment in cheap aluminium that became Alcoa. In 1901, When a Texas hill called Spindletop erupted with oil, Mellon money was there at the birth of Gulf oil. Carnegie made steel and made noise. Rockefeller made oil and made enemies. The Mellons made everything, and made almost no sound at all. By 1913, Mellon National Bank held more money on deposit than any bank in Pittsburgh, and the second largest was theirs too. They did not build the tallest tower. They owned the ground beneath the towers, the bank that lent for the towers, the aluminium in the towers, and the oil that lit them. A fortune that in today's dollars ran into the tens of billions, assembled by a family that the rest of America could barely name. The empire was real, the empire was enormous, and the empire was about to acquire the one thing Thomas Mellon had spent his whole life teaching his sons to live without. In September 1900, Andrew Mellon did the one thing his father's entire philosophy forbade. He fell in love. She was Nora McMullen, English, from Hertfordshire, the daughter of a brewing family, and not yet 21. He was 45. The silent banker, the confirmed bachelor, the man who as a young suitor had once, on his father's instruction, broken off an engagement to his first love simply because she had fallen ill with consumption. Now, a quarter of a century later, the coldest man in Pittsburgh crossed an ocean and brought home a bride young enough to be his daughter. Picture it. The mansion blazing with light. The richest unmarried man in the state, finally married. His father Thomas, 87 years old, the boy from the dirt road, still alive to see his most successful son crowned by a beautiful young wife. The dynasty looked, in that single season, untouchable. The money was vast. The name was clean. The line would continue. The following June, a daughter arrived, Ailsa, an heir to one of the largest private fortunes on earth, born into a house of marble and silence. It was the highest the Mellons would ever stand, and it was already over. They simply did not know it yet. Look closely at the wedding photographs. And one detail refuses to leave you. The bride is not smiling. Nora McMullen arrived in Pittsburgh, and was, in the careful words of the family's own biographer, appalled and bewildered by it, by the soot, by the grey, by a husband who spent his days at the bank and, when home, had almost nothing to say to her. He was a man who could read a balance sheet across a darkened room and could not read his own wife across a dinner table. The father had taught the son that feeling was weakness. The son had finally allowed himself to feel and had no idea what to do next. And there was the child. Little Ailsa, born into that cold marble quiet, would grow into a fearful, fragile, withdrawn woman who spent her enormous life hiding from the world. The silence was already being inherited. Within 8 years, the most powerful banker in America would hire private detectives to follow his own wife across 2 continents. Within 12, he would do something no rich man had ever managed before. He would persuade an entire state legislature to rewrite its divorce laws, for him, in secret, so that the woman he had married for love could be destroyed quietly. To understand how a love story curdled into the cruelest divorce of the Gilded Age, we have to go back to the year the smiling stopped. For a few years the surface held. A second child arrived in 1907, a son Paul, and now the dynasty had what every dynasty craves, an heir and a spare. The fortune compounded in the background like weather, new properties, new directorships. A patriarch's dream of permanence, made of brick and bond certificates. In 1908, Thomas Mellon died at 95. In the city he had refused to be poor in. He died, by every visible measure, a man who had won. 5 sons set up in business, a bank bearing his name, a grandson and granddaughter to carry the line. The boy from the dirt road had built something that looked like it would outlast the century. And this is the moment to be most careful, because this is exactly when these stories lie to you, the wide shots of the estate. The christening gowns, the sense that the hard part is over and the family is safe. It was not safe. Inside that marble house, a young woman was suffocating. Nora was a wife in name, a mother in fact, and a stranger in her own home, married to a man who governed money the way other men breathe, and who would not, speak to her about anything that mattered. She was lonely, in the specific way that only the very rich can be lonely, surrounded by everything, accompanied by no one. And then, into that silence, walked a man who knew exactly how to talk to a lonely woman with a fortune behind her. His name was Alfred George Curfey. He was English, charming, married, and, depending on which account you read, a dealer in antiques, a bottler of mineral water, and a connoisseur of wealthy women's unhappiness. He was, in plain terms, The kind of man Thomas Mellon had spent a lifetime warning his sons about. Dot and Nora, starved of warmth, fell. The discovery came the way these things always come. A name repeated too often. A trip explained too smoothly. A husband who counted everything, finally counting the days his wife was gone. He did not rage. That was not his nature. Andrew Mellon did something far colder. He hired detectives. According to historian David Nassau, Mellon hired detectives to trail Nora and gather evidence of past liaisons, building a file on the woman he had married, brick by brick, the way his father had once built files on debtors. He had her followed across Europe. He intercepted. He documented. He assembled, with bankers' patience, a case against his own wife. Think of the symmetry. The founder made his fortune turning other people's private weakness into his own gain. The son now turned his wife's private weakness into ammunition. The method never changed, only the target did. But here is the part the press of the day never fully untangled, and the part you must hold on to. Who was Alfred Kerfey, really? Because there is evidence that he did not merely seduce Nora. There is evidence that the affair came braided with money, demands, threats, the long shadow of blackmail, and that Andrew Mellon believed, rightly or wrongly, that his wife had not simply strayed but had been worked, like a mark. Was Nora a guilty woman, or a trapped one, a villain, or a girl sold into a marble cage at 20 and then preyed upon by the first man, who was kind to her? The Mellon money would spend the next 4 years making sure the world only ever heard one version. In her own later years, Nora described the marriage in language that never softened. She had felt, she said, like a prisoner of his fortune. In 1910, Andrew began keeping a private diary. A man who had spent 55 years saying nothing, now quietly writing things down. What he confided to those pages would not surface for decades. The marriage was finished. 2 children, a continent of money, and a name that controlled half of Pittsburgh, and none of it could hold 2 people in a room. Now came the question that would define the family for a century. When a Mellon is wounded, what does a Mellon do? The answer was not grief. The answer was war. The first casualties of that war were not Andrew and Nora. They were 2 small children. Ailsa was 9, Paul was barely 3. And as their parents' marriage detonated, they became what children of dynasties so often become. Not people to be protected, but assets to be allocated. Custody was leverage. The children were terms in a negotiation between a man who owned a bank and a woman fighting to keep her own son and daughter. Paul Mellon would remember almost nothing warm from those years. Decades later, looking back across a long life, he described a childhood governed by tension, by a father he could not reach, and a mother he was being pulled away from. The boy grew up understanding, very early, that in this family love was conditional, and money was not. That affection could be withdrawn, but the fortune was forever. And there it is. Watch the inheritance pass, not the money, the wound. Thomas Mellon taught Andrew that feeling was weakness. Andrew, in the wreckage of his marriage, taught his own children the same brutal lesson without ever meaning to, that the safest thing to love is something that can't leave you. Like a bank balance, like a painting, like a coin, that fearful, withdrawn girl from the cold dining table, Ailsa, would carry it the furthest. She would grow into one of the wealthiest women in the world, and one of the most hidden, a recluse who shrank from crowds, from press, from life itself, guarding her privacy like a wound that never closed. The silence we first saw in the wedding photographs had found its true heir. It would not be the last time the family's money outlived the family's capacity for happiness. What is the use of the largest fortune in Pennsylvania if it produces a daughter too frightened to be seen? This is peak 2, not a death, not yet. Something quieter and worse. The moment a marriage entered as a love story becomes a thing measured by lawyers, and 2 children learn the family's oldest doctrine before they are old enough to spell it. The dynasty was richer than ever, and it had just manufactured, in its own nursery, the next generation of beautifully funded loneliness. But the public saw none of it. Out in the newspapers, the Mellons were unity itself, respectable, philanthropic, untouchable. The gap between that public face and the private war was about to become the most carefully engineered cover-up of the age. Here is what America was allowed to know. Almost nothing. In the press, Andrew Mellon remained the sober, civic-minded financier, the man whose name meant safety, whose money built Pittsburgh, whose private life was a closed and dignified door. The newspapers spoke of the bank, the philanthropy, the directorships. They did not speak of detectives, or of a young wife followed across Europe. or of a mineral water salesman named Curfew. The public letters, measured, generous, statesmanlike. The private letters, a forensic dossier of a marriage being dismantled for evidence. And about Curfew. The deeper you dig, the stranger he becomes. This was not a tidy romance. Accounts trace a pattern of a charming man and the moneyed women around him, of debts and demands and pressure applied where it would hurt a proud family most. Andrew Mellon did not just want a divorce. He wanted the threat removed, the file sealed, the story buried so deep that the Mellon name would never touch it. A lesser man would have paid quietly and looked away. Andrew Mellon was not a lesser man. He was the most powerful private citizen in the state, and he was about to use that power in a way no American had ever used it inside a marriage. Because what Andrew Mellon did next was not to fight his wife in court. It was to change the courts themselves. In 1909, a bill quietly began moving through the Pennsylvania legislature. Almost no one understood what it was really for. It was for her. To understand what Andrew Mellon did in 1909, you have to understand what divorce was in Pennsylvania at the time. It was public. It was slow. And, most dangerously for a man like Mellon, the evidence was heard in open court, where any reporter with a notebook could write down every word about a wife followed across Europe and a husband who had paid men to follow her. For most husbands, that exposure was simply the price of freedom. Andrew Mellon refused to pay it, so he did what only the richest man in the state could do. He reached into the machinery of government itself. In 1909, a bill appeared in the Pennsylvania legislature proposing something that had never existed there before, the right to try a divorce before a jury, and crucially, the procedural cover that came with it. On its face, it was dry, technical, the sort of reform no voter would ever notice. In reality, as historians of the family have documented, it was tailored to the needs of one man and one marriage. The Mellons owned banks, they owned oil, they owned aluminium, and in that moment they reached for something more valuable than any of it. The power to rewrite the rules of the state to fit a single private grievance. Stop and feel the size of that. We are not talking about a rich man hiring the best lawyer. We are talking about a private citizen altering the divorce statute of an entire commonwealth so that his own separation could be handled on his terms. That is not wealth, that is sovereignty. Mellon had become, inside the borders of Pennsylvania, something close to a state within the state. When word of the maneuver began to leak, it caused exactly the scandal he had spent everything to avoid. Nora fought. She had her own lawyers, her own version, and a mother's terror of losing her children. The fight dragged across years and continents. Accusations, counter-accusations, the boy Paul and the girl Ailsa passed between households like contested property. And through all of it, Andrew Mellon kept building his file, the detectives, the intercepted letters, the diary he had begun keeping in 1910, the private ledger of a man who never spoke. He was assembling not just a divorce, but a verdict, a complete documented, unanswerable case that Nora was the guilty party and he the wronged husband. Here is the cruelty hidden inside the genius. Nora's alleged crime was a love affair, a few years of warmth stolen from a cold marriage. Andrew's response was to spend a fortune and bend a legislature to brand her, permanently and publicly, as the villain of her own life. Her sin was emotional, his was structural, and only one of them had the power to write the official record. The divorce was finalized in 1912. Andrew Mellon got his freedom, his children, and his reputation intact. Nora got a settlement, a schedule of access to her own son and daughter, and a permanent place as the cautionary tale in the Mellon story. He had won, completely, the way his father had taught him to win, and it had cost him the one thing his father had warned him never to want in the first place. But who, in the end, betrayed whom? That is the question that makes this more than a rich man's divorce. Because the easy story, faithless wife, wronged husband, was the story Mellon money manufactured. The truer story is more disturbing. Andrew Mellon did not lose Nora to Alfred Curfew. He lost her years earlier, to a marriage built on his father's blueprint, in which a 20-year-old girl was acquired like an asset, installed in a soot-grey city, and then left alone with a husband who could fund any desire she had, except the desire to be loved. Curfew was the symptom. The marriage was the disease. And the architect of the disease was not even in the room. He was a dead man, Thomas Mellon, whose doctrine that feeling is weakness had reached forward across 2 generations and poisoned a wedding he never attended. The deepest betrayal in this story is not a wife's affair. It is a father betraying a son by raising him to be incapable of love, and then that son, without ever choosing it, betraying his own children the very same way. Nora was branded the traitor, but she was also the only adult in that marble house who ever tried, however clumsily, to feel something real. She lost everything for it. After the divorce, the fortune did exactly what Thomas Mellon designed it to do. It grew. The 1910s and 1920s were a golden tide for the family. Gulf oil gushed. Alcoa held a near-total grip on American aluminium. Mellon National Bank towered over Pittsburgh. Andrew Mellon, freed of his marriage, poured himself entirely into the only relationship that had never disappointed him: capital. And the children? The two small terms in the 1912 negotiation? Ailsa, the daughter, withdrew. She grew into a woman of staggering wealth and staggering fragility, anxious, reclusive, frightened of the public gaze, clinging to her father with an intensity that worried everyone around her. She had learned the family lesson perfectly. People leave, money stays. So she trusted the money. Paul, the son, spent his early life trying to escape the gravity of the name, and decades trying to undo the coldness in himself that his upbringing had installed. He would later become one of the great art collectors and philanthropists in American history, a man who gave away beauty as if trying to buy back the warmth his own childhood had been denied. He once described his father, with devastating economy, as a man who simply did not know how to be a father. This is the engine of the whole tragedy, and now you can see it running. The money is healthy, the bloodline is not. Each generation inherits a larger fortune and a smaller capacity for happiness. The estate compounds, the loneliness compounds faster. And just when Andrew Mellon stood at the absolute summit of American power, running the nation's treasury under 3 presidents, the second great catastrophe of his life came for him. This time, it was the government's turn to hire the detectives. In 1921, Andrew Mellon became Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. He would hold the office for almost 11 years, under Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, longer than any Treasury Secretary before or since. He slashed taxes on the wealthy. He paid down war debt. He was lionized as the greatest Treasury head since Alexander Hamilton. There was as a saying in Washington in the 1920s. 3 presidents served under Mellon. For a decade, a man who could not hold a marriage together held the financial machinery of the most powerful nation on earth in his 2 hands. The boy from the dirt road had a grandson running America's money, and then 1929 happened. The crash, the depression, the breadlines, and the long, slow turning of public fury toward the men who had presided over the boom. Mellon, austere, aloof, fabulously rich while millions starved, became a symbol of everything that had failed. He was the rich man at the top of the broken machine. In 1932, with impeachment rumblings in Congress, Hoover quietly moved him out of the Treasury and off to London as ambassador. The reign was over. And when Franklin Roosevelt swept into power in 1933, the new administration did something extraordinary. It came after Andrew Mellon personally. Remember the founder's craft, turning other men's weakness into legal advantage. Remember the son's craft, building a forensic file against his own wife. Now watch the wheel turn one final time. The United States government built a forensic file against him. In 1934, the Roosevelt administration accused Andrew Mellon of income tax fraud. The charge, that the man who had run the nation's treasury, the high priest of American finance, had cheated on his own taxes. It was front-page humiliation, and it was meant to be. To his enemies, it was justice. To Mellon, it was a political vendetta dressed as law, the state using its full machinery against a single private citizen. And if that phrasing sounds familiar, it should. It is precisely what he had done to Nora. The most powerful institution available turned against one person, to brand them guilty in the permanent public record. Andrew Mellons spent the last years of his life on the receiving end of his own family's signature weapon. The case dragged before the Board of Tax Appeals through 1935, 1936, into 1937. Mellon, now in his 80s, sat through it. He maintained, with the cold certainty of a man who had counted every dollar of his life, that he had paid what he owed, and not a cent had been hidden. He did not live to hear the verdict. Andrew William Mellon died on August 26, 1937, at the age of 82. Months later, the board delivered its finding. There had been no fraud. He had not cheated. In the narrow legal sense, he was vindicated. The dead man was cleared. But it no longer mattered. The vindication came to a gravestone. Consider the two great loves of Andrew Mellon's life and how each one ended. The marriage detonated, his wife branded, his children wounded. The career, the highest office in American finance, ended in disgrace and a fraud trial he won only after death. Everything he built with feeling collapsed. Everything he built with money survived him. That was the verdict on the whole life. And it returns us at last to the locked book. Back at the very beginning, I told you the founder, Thomas Mellon, wrote down a single governing principle about the human heart. And that he meant it as wisdom for his descendants. It is time to open the book. In his 1885 memoir, Thomas Mellon and His Times, the founder set down his philosophy of love and marriage with a banker's brutal clarity. He had, as a young man, been engaged to a girl he cared for. And when she fell ill, he reasoned his way out of the attachment, concluding that it was unwise to bind your fortunes and your feelings to something so fragile, so likely to bring loss. Sentiment, he taught, was a poor foundation. A man should choose with his head. Affection was a risk to be managed, like any other. He wrote it down so his children would be wiser than other men's children. So they would never be made fools of by their own hearts. That was the seed. That was the darkest secret of the Mellons. Not a crime, not a body, but a doctrine. A founder who looked at love, decided it was weakness, and deliberately engineered it out of his bloodline as carefully as he engineered debt off a balance sheet. And it worked. That is the horror of it. It worked perfectly. Andrew obeyed it as a young man when he abandoned his sick first love. He violated it once, with Nora, and the violation nearly destroyed him, which only seemed to prove the founder right. So he taught it to Ailsa and Paul in turn. People leave, money stays. Love is the most expensive mistake a Mellon can make. The founder built a fortune designed to last forever. To protect it, he disabled in his own descendants the one faculty that makes a fortune worth having. The money would now outlive love in this family for 100 years, and it would keep killing them gently, one heir at a time, all the way down to a hotel room in Cancun. When Andrew Mellon died in 1937, the fortune passed, as fortunes in this family always did, intact and enormous. His daughter Ailsa inherited a sum that made her one of the richest women on earth. She spent the rest of her life hiding from it. Picture the granddaughter of the boy from the dirt road. A woman who could buy almost anything, surrounded by staff, by houses, by art, and who flinched from crowds, dreaded the press, and arranged her days around the avoidance of being seen. The anxious, fragile child from the cold marble dining table never left. She simply grew older inside the same fear. Elsa Mellon Bruce died in 1969. By some accounts, she was, at that moment, the wealthiest woman in the United States. She left a single daughter and a vast estate, much of which, to her lasting credit, flowed into the National Gallery of Art that her father had founded and her brother would steward. But look at the shape of the life, the largest female fortune in America, attached to one of the loneliest women in it. This is the founder's doctrine, fully matured. Ailsa had been taught, from birth, that money is the only thing that never abandons you. So she clung to the money and let go of the world. She was the purest product of the Mellon machine. And she was a warning her own family did not read. Her brother Paul tried to read it. He spent his whole life trying. Paul Mellon is the closest thing this story has to hope. Where his father hoarded and his sister hid, Paul gave. He poured the fortune outward, into the National Gallery, into Yale, into the Virginia countryside, where he bred racehorses and, by every account, finally found something like peace. He once described himself, with disarming honesty, as an amateur in every field, a man deliberately running in the opposite direction from his father's grim mastery. Andrew Mellon collected power. Paul Mellon collected paintings and gave them away. Andrew could not speak to his wife. Paul went into psychoanalysis, for years, trying to dig out the coldness his upbringing had buried in him. He was the first Mellon in 3 generations to look the family doctrine in the eye and say, "This is what is wrong with us, and here is the painful truth." Even Paul, the kindest, most self-aware, most healed of them, could not fully undo it. He wrote of the distance between himself and his own father that never closed. He carried the wound even as he treated it. You do not erase 3 generations of engineered coldness in one lifetime, no matter how much beauty you give away. Paul Mellon died in 1999, genuinely beloved, a great philanthropist, the best of the line. But the doctrine did not die with the good man who fought it. It traveled sideways and downward through the wider family into branches that had the name and the money and the wound, but not Paul's discipline and not Paul's luck. And in one of those branches, a child was born in 1964. His name was Matthew Taylor Mellon. He had everything the Dynasty had spent a century accumulating: the name that built American banking, a trust fund, an entry into every room that mattered. He grew up among horses and houses and the quiet, weightless certainty of inherited money. He married into fashion royalty. His wife, Tamara, co-founded the shoe empire Jimmy Choo. For a while, Matthew Mellon was exactly what the name promised: glamorous, wealthy, untouchable. But he carried the family inheritance, both of them, the fortune and the wound. He struggled, openly, with addiction, with OxyContin, with the particular emptiness of a man who had been given everything material and was still, somehow, starving for something money had never been able to buy in this family. Then, late in his life, came one last, dizzying, Mellon-scale fortune. Matthew bet early on a cryptocurrency called XRP, the digital token tied to Ripple. The bet detonated. At its peak, his stake was reported to be worth somewhere close to $1 billion. A new fortune, in a new currency born of the same family appetite for the next frontier of money: oil, aluminium, banking, and now code. A descendant of the men who financed Gulf Oil and Alcoa had just made $1 billion on the internet. The Mellon instinct for capital had survived everything: the divorce, the depression, the tax trial, 4 generations. The genius for money never died. The capacity for happiness was a different story, because for all the new wealth, Matthew Mellon was drowning. The addiction had him. In April 2018, he made the decision that so many in his position make too late. He would get help. He arranged to travel to a treatment facility in Mexico, a clinic that used the hallucinogen ayahuasca to break the grip of opioid dependence, a last attempt to be free. He flew to Cancun. He checked into a hotel the night before he was due at the clinic. And now you know what was waiting on that nightstand. The intake form for the clinic he never reached. The fortune, $500 million by the most cautious count, sitting in a digital wallet. And a man worth more than most countries, dying alone in a rented room in a foreign city, exactly the way his great-aunt Ailsa had hidden and his great-grandfather Andrew had grieved, surrounded by everything, accompanied by no one. Matthew Mellon was 54 years old. The Dirt Road Boys doctrine had claimed its last heir. Lay the deaths side by side. That is the only way to see what this family actually was. Thomas Mellon, the founder, died in 1908 at 95. A winner by every measure he believed in, and a man who had spent his life teaching the people he loved most that love was a liability. Andrew Mellon, the son, died in 1937, the most powerful financier in America. His marriage detonated, his children wounded, his name dragged through a fraud trial he was cleared of only after he was in the ground. Ailsa, the granddaughter, died in 1969, perhaps the richest woman in the country, and one of the most frightened, hiding from the world until the world stopped looking. Matthew, the last of this line, died in 2018, a fresh $1 billion fortune in his name, alone in a Cancun hotel, an unsigned rehab form on the table beside him. 4 deaths, 4 generations, 1 cause of death. Not oil, not banking, not crypto. The cause of death was a sentence written in a memoir in 1885, that feeling is weakness and money is the only safe thing to love, and obeyed, with terrible loyalty, by everyone who inherited it. This is the bitter truth the Mellon story exists to deliver. We tell ourselves that money is protection, that if we could just accumulate enough, our children would be safe. The Mellons ran that experiment to its absolute limit. They got more money than almost any family in American history. They financed the modern industrial world. They ran the treasury. They made fortunes in 3 different centuries. And it protected none of them from the one thing that actually kills people: the slow starvation of a heart that was taught, from birth, not to need anyone. So ask the question the whole video has been building toward. What good is a fortune that can buy any house on earth, if every house it buys is one you end up dying alone inside? The founder thought he was protecting his bloodline. He was poisoning it, and the poison was so well disguised, dressed up as wisdom, as prudence, as strength, that 4 generations swallowed it without ever tasting what it was. Be careful here, because it would be easy to walk away with the wrong lesson. The lesson is not, money is evil. Money built the National Gallery. Money, in Paul Mellon's hands, gave the world beauty and saved institutions. Money is not the villain of this story. The villain is the trade. The quiet generational trade that Thomas Mellon made on behalf of everyone who would ever carry his name. Security in exchange for tenderness. Permanence in exchange for warmth. He decided that a heart was too dangerous to keep, and he taught his children to amputate it early, before it could cost them anything. What he never understood, what cost his descendants 100 years to learn, and some of them their lives, is that the heart is not the weakness in the system, it is the point of the system. The fortune was only ever supposed to be the tool. He made it the master. And this is where the story stops being about a dead family in Pittsburgh and starts being about you. Because every one of us makes a smaller version of Thomas Mellon's trade. Every hour traded away from the people we love for the security we think will protect them. Every time we tell ourselves we'll be present later. Once the money is safe, once the work is done, once we've built enough. The Mellons are the proof of where that road ends. They built enough. They built more than enough. They built a fortune that outlived 4 generations of the people who were supposed to enjoy it. And it bought them the loneliest deaths money could buy. That is the inheritance, not the billions. The emptiness the billions were standing in for. There is a brick house, somewhere in your memory of this story, that a barefoot boy once stopped to stare at on a Pennsylvania road 200 years ago. He wanted it so badly that he built an empire to make sure he would never again be the boy outside looking in. He succeeded beyond any reasonable dream. His family went inside. Inside the mansions, inside the banks, inside the treasury, inside the rooms where the country's money was decided. And one by one, across 100 years, they died in there. Behind the marble. Behind the money. Behind the doctrine that told them the safest thing to love was the thing that could never love them back. The Mellons were America's quietest billionaires. Now you know why they were so quiet. It is hard to make noise when there is no one in the room with you. Remember that the next time you tell yourself you'll be present later. Once you've built enough. The richest family in America never figured out when enough was. Don't make their trade.